Today we're looking at the absolute bedrock of human psychology. I mean, we are going to completely strip away the hypothetical stuff.
Right, bypass all that surface-level self-help advice.
Exactly. And we're going to look at the human mind under what is arguably the most extreme, unimaginable stress test in recorded history.
It really is.
So imagine just for a second that everything you use to define yourself is completely demolished. Your identity, your career, your family, your possessions,
Including your bank account, yeah.
all of it gone. Then you take away your basic physical needs. No adequate food, no warm bed, not even the clothes on your back.
Stripped bare.
Right. When the entire external structure of your life vanishes overnight, what is actually left? What is the core of a human being when there is literally nowhere left to hide?
It's the ultimate existential question.
Yeah.
And the source material for our deep dive today answers it. Not with abstract theory, but with brutal, lived experience.
Which is what makes it so powerful.
Exactly. We are exploring the clinical observations and the philosophies documented in Viktor E. Frankl's monumental work, Man's Search for Meaning.
Such an incredible piece of work.
It is. Frankl was already this highly prominent psychiatrist and neurologist in Vienna before the outbreak of World War II. He subsequently survived the horrors of the Holocaust, enduring multiple concentration camps, including Auschwitz.
Yeah.
But what we are analyzing today isn't just a historical memoir. That's a key distinction. It is a meticulous psychological autopsy of the human mind under catastrophic duress.
And the mission of this deep dive is to really unpack those clinical observations. We want to understand the actual psychology of survival.
The mechanics of it.
Right, the structural architecture of hope, really, and how we can apply these incredibly hard-won lessons to find purpose in our own modern lives.
Because it's about inner freedom.
Exactly. We're looking at how a person manages to maintain their inner psychological freedom when every single ounce of their outer physical freedom has been violently taken away.
To do this justice, though, we have to establish our parameters early on.
Good point.
The historical context of this text, the Holocaust, the systemic extermination of millions by the Nazi regime, is a profoundly dark, deeply emotional, and politically charged chapter of human history.
Of course.
But for the purposes of this analysis, we're functioning strictly as impartial observers of the text. We aren't here to litigate the history or, endorse specific political viewpoints.
We're looking at the science.
Right. We're simply reporting on the objective psychological insights and existential philosophies exactly as they are detailed in the original source material. Our focus is the mechanics of the human mind as observed from the inside of the camps.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand the psychology of the camps, we actually have to start slightly before them.
We have to look at the anatomy of an impossible choice.
Right, because before he was a prisoner, Frankl was this highly respected medical professional in Vienna. The noose of the Nazi regime was tightening around Austria.
Things were getting very bad, very fast.
And shortly before the United States entered the war, he receives a notification. He's told to come to the American consulate in Vienna to pick up his immigration visa.
You have to understand the immense weight of that piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, an American visa at that specific moment in history was essentially a golden ticket to life.
His elderly parents were ecstatic.
They fully expected him to take it. To escape the looming catastrophe, find safe harbor in the United States, and just continue his medical practice and write his books.
From a purely logical self-preservation standpoint, the decision is a mathematical certainty. You take the visa.
You take the visa and you run.
But he doesn't immediately take it. He is paralyzed by this agonizing internal conflict.
It's the ultimate dilemma.
On one side of the scale, he has his life's work.
Yeah.
He called his developing psychological theory of logotherapy his brainchild.
Right. If he leaves, he saves the theory. He gets to plant it in fertile soil, publish it, build his legacy.
But on the other side of the scale, he has his parents. If he uses that visa, he escapes, sure. But he abandons them to face the Nazi terror completely alone.
Which at that point meant almost certain deportation to a concentration camp.
So he's wrestling with the ultimate question of responsibility. Does he owe his life to his intellectual contributions to humanity or to the people who gave him life?
The clinical detachment he later uses in the camps is actually already visible here. He analyzes his own paralysis.
He steps outside himself.
Yes. He recognizes that human logic has reached its absolute limit. When reason cannot solve a moral dilemma of this magnitude, the mind starts looking for an external sign.
He explicitly wrote that he wished for a hint from heaven.
He needed something to break the deadlock between his professional ambition and his familial devotion.
And the way that hint arrives is, it's almost cinematic. He comes home one day from this agonizing mental loop, and he sees a piece of marble lying on a table in his family's apartment.
Just a broken fragment.
Right, but he asks his father where it came from.
His father had salvaged it from the ruins of the largest Viennese synagogue, which had just been burned to the ground by the National Socialists.
So the piece of marble wasn't just rubble.
No, it was a specific fragment of the tablets that held the Ten Commandments over the altar.
The detail here is staggering to me. The marble fragment had one single gilded Hebrew letter engraved on it.
One letter.
And Frankl asks his father which specific commandment that letter represents. And his father tells him it stands for the commandment. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land.
That is the psychological tipping point.
It's incredible.
The sheer synchronicity of that moment just shattered his indecision. He didn't view it as magic, mind you. He viewed it as a profound mandate of meaning.
A clear answer.
In that exact fraction of a second, he decided to let his American visa lapse. He chose to stay in Vienna, to stay upon the land with his parents, actively sacrificing his guaranteed escape.
He chose to share in whatever fate awaited them. This wasn't a passive resignation either. It was a highly conscious, deliberate choice, grounded in responsibility.
Which sets the stage for the descent into the abyss. When he's eventually deported, Frankl begins mapping the psychological geography of the concentration camp inmate.
He observes that a prisoner's mental state moves through 3 distinct phases.
Phase 1 is shock.
But it's not just surprise. It is an absolute paralyzing psychological fracturing. To grasp it, you really have to picture the arrival.
It's unfathomable.
You've been shoved into a train car with 1,500 other people. There are 80 people packed into a single coach designed for a fraction of that.
You are lying on your own luggage, traveling for days and nights.
You don't know where you are. The dawn is just breaking. It's gray. It's freezing cold.
Then the train whistle blows. The text describes it as an uncanny, haunting sound, almost like a cry for help from the train itself.
They realize they are nearing a main station, and suddenly, panic ripples through the packed carriage.
Someone spots a sign.
And they scream, Auschwitz! By this time, the very name was a mythological terror.
It represented the absolute worst of human imagination: gas chambers, crematoriums, industrialized massacres.
The human nervous system literally cannot process that level of impending doom all at once.
It just shuts down.
Right. As the train pulls in, the visual reality hits them. Endless grids of barbed wire, towering watchtowers, armed guards, and the haunting silhouette of ragged human figures trudging through the fog.
But right at the precipice of this total terror, the brain executes an incredibly bizarre defense mechanism. Frankl introduces a concept from clinical psychiatry called the delusion of reprieve.
I have found this part so fascinating.
It is a fascinating and tragic phenomenon. We see this in condemned individuals moments before an execution. The mind, desperate to avoid the reality of imminent death, conjures a sudden, overpowering illusion that a pardon will arrive at the very last possible second.
It's an extreme form of cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. The environment is screaming death, but the brain creates a firewall of irrational hope just to prevent an immediate psychological collapse.
And Frankl experiences this firsthand. The train doors are violently thrown open, and a squad of prisoners storms into the carriage.
But here's the catch.
Right. These prisoners are wearing striped uniforms, their heads are shaved, but they look relatively healthy. They are well-fed, they're speaking multiple languages and making these dark, grotesque jokes.
Frankl's brain instantly latches onto this visual anomaly.
He thinks, wait, these guys look okay, they're in good spirits, maybe things aren't as bad as the rumors, maybe I can figure out how to get into their group.
He is projecting his survival instinct onto them. What the new arrivals do not know, what their delusion of reprieve hides from them, is that these men are a specialized receiving squad.
They're an elite group.
Basically, yes. They're deliberately kept well-fed by the SS because their job is to handle the massive influx of luggage, sort the contraband, and essentially manage the logistics of the incoming transports.
So they are the exception that proves the horrific rule.
Yes, but the desperate mind clings to them as proof of a potential future.
That firewall of hope is demolished almost immediately, though. They're forced out of the train, ordered to leave all their luggage behind, everything they packed for their so-called resettlement, and they are separated into two lines.
Men on one side, women on the other.
And they are marched forward. This is where we see the banality of evil in its most distilled form. They are marched past a tall, immaculate SS officer.
Frankl observes him standing there in an attitude of complete, careless ease.
He is supporting his right elbow with his left hand, and he's just using his right forefinger to point, leisurely pointing left, right, right.
The infamous first selection. The finger game.
It's chilling.
The prisoners walking up to him have absolutely no concept of the monstrous mathematics behind that casual flick of the wrist. To the right meant you were deemed fit for slave labor.
And to the left.
To the left meant you were considered sick, elderly, frail, or a child.
Yeah.
And left meant the gas chambers. Immediate extermination.
Frankl approaches the officer, trying to look as vibrant and healthy as possible. He hides his heavy haversack under his coat, forces himself to walk upright, masking any fatigue.
The officer looks at him, hesitates for a microsecond, and then pushes Frankl's shoulders to the right.
A microsecond hesitation. His entire existence, all his future contributions to psychology, hinged on a whim.
Literally a flick of a finger.
Later that evening, the prisoners who went to the right asked the veterans where their friends and families who were sent to the left went.
The veterans just point to a chimney in the distance, violently blowing flames into the night sky.
90% of Frankl's transport was eradicated in those first few hours. The sheer, terrifying randomness of survival shatters any remaining delusion.
Which accelerates the shock phase into a physical and psychological stripping of identity. They are herded into an anteroom and told they have exactly 2 minutes to undress completely.
2 minutes?
They are allowed to keep nothing but their shoes, their belts, or suspenders. Everything else is confiscated.
Think about the psychological weight of clothes, of personal items. They anchor us to our societal roles, our history, our individuality.
When you remove them under threat of violence, you are performing a systematic erasure of the self.
Frankl actually makes one desperate attempt to hold on to a fragment of his past. He approaches an older, veteran prisoner. He pulls out a roll of paper from his coat pocket.
The manuscript of his life's work.
Yes, the foundational text of logotherapy. He pleads with the man, explaining that it is a scientific masterpiece, that he must keep it at all costs.
The veteran's reaction is incredibly telling regarding the culture of the camp. He doesn't offer sympathy, he doesn't explain the rules.
He just flashes a mocking, insulting grin and screams a single expletive at him. Shit.
That brutal dismissal forces Frankl to realize that the currency of his past life, intellect, status, scientific achievement, has zero value here.
He had to cross out his entire former existence. He stood there possessing literally nothing but his naked body. He kept only his glasses and his belt, and the belt was later traded for a scrap of bread.
But here's where it gets really interesting. You would assume that a group of people, standing stark naked, shivering in the late autumn chill, having just realized their families were murdered and they are next, would descend into uncontrollable panic, screaming, or catatonic despair.
Right, that would be the expected human reaction.
But Frankl notes that 2 entirely unexpected emotions emerged instead: cold curiosity and a grim sense of humor.
Cold curiosity.
Yes, cold curiosity is a highly sophisticated, involuntary psychological defense. Frankl compares it to the detachment he once felt during a severe mountain climbing accident.
Interesting.
When the mind is confronted with a reality so horrific that it threatens to destroy the psyche instantly, it essentially unplugs the emotional core and shifts into a hyper-observational mode.
It turns the horror into a clinical subject.
Exactly. Standing naked in the freezing wind, waiting for the showers, the men actually found themselves curious. Would they catch a cold? Would the water be freezing? They became detached spectators of their own impending demise.
And the humor. It sounds absurd, but he writes that they all tried desperately to make fun of themselves and each other.
Because when the shower heads actually produced real water instead of poisonous gas, the relief was so profound it manifested as a dark, grim comedy.
They looked at each other and realized they had absolutely nothing left to lose except their ridiculously naked lives.
Humor, even in its darkest form, is an assertion of humanity. It is a way of saying, I am still an observing consciousness capable of recognizing absurdity.
It creates a tiny fraction of distance between the self and the suffering.
This detachment also allowed them to observe some astonishing medical anomalies. Frankl notes that everything the medical textbooks taught about human limitations was wrong.
Right, the textbooks say you need a certain amount of sleep, a certain caloric intake, specific hygiene to survive.
But these men were sleeping soundly on hard wooden boards, 9 men crammed into a single tier, sharing 2 filthy blankets.
They couldn't brush their teeth. They had severe vitamin deficiencies, yet their gums were somehow healthier than they were in Vienna.
They wore the exact same shirt for half a year until it was completely unrecognizable as fabric.
They worked in freezing dirt with deep, open lacerations on their hands, and miraculously, the wounds didn't turn septic.
It's a physiological manifestation of Dostoevsky's observation. Yes, a man can get used to anything, but do not ask us how.
The human organism is incredibly resilient when survival is the only imperative.
However, this adrenaline-fueled state of shock, curiosity, and physiological overdrive is unsustainable. Eventually, the reality of the prolonged, inescapable nightmare settles in, and that drags the prisoner into the second phase of mental reaction.
Phase 2. This is where the armor goes up. The psychological shock gives way to a profound, suffocating apathy. It is essentially an emotional death.
Apathy is the necessary consequence of overexposure to trauma. If the human mind reacted with genuine horror, pity, or disgust to every atrocity witnessed in a concentration camp, the neurological system would burn out in a matter of days.
So it adapts.
To survive, the mind builds a thick, calloused shell. It blunts the emotions. It shuts down the capacity for empathy and revulsion because those emotions are lethal liabilities in that environment.
The text gives a chilling, visceral example of just how deep this emotional death goes. Frankl is sitting in a hut that serves as a makeshift ward for typhus patients.
A horrific environment on its own.
A man had just died. Frankl is sitting by a window, holding his daily ration, a bowl of watery hot soup. He watches the other prisoners react to the dead man.
And there is no mourning.
None. One prisoner immediately grabs the dead man's leftover potatoes. Another strips him of his wooden shoes. Another takes his coat.
And the block nurse comes in to remove the body. He grabs the corpse by the ankles and drags it out.
Frankl is looking out the window, eating his soup. The corpse is dragged up the steps outside, the head thumping violently against each wooden stair with a sickening rattling noise.
The dead man's glazed eyes stare directly through the window at Frankl. Keep in mind, this is a man Frankl had been having a conversation with just 2 hours prior.
And Frankl's reaction? Nothing. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't lose his appetite. He just continues sipping his hot soup.
He writes that if his own lack of emotion hadn't surprised him from a purely clinical psychiatric standpoint, he wouldn't even have remembered the incident.
That is the architecture of apathy. The normal human reactions of disgust and horror simply cease to exist.
But apathy isn't a perfect shield. It protects against the ambient horror, but there are specific types of trauma that pierce right through it.
Oh, definitely.
What's fascinating here is that the most unbearable suffering wasn't necessarily the physical pain of the daily beatings. It was the psychological insult, the deliberate degradation of the soul.
He shares a story that perfectly illustrates this. He's working on a railway track in the middle of a brutal snowstorm. He pauses for just a few seconds, leaning on his shovel to catch his breath.
Just a moment of rest.
A guard spots him. Now, you would expect the guard to scream or curse or beat him with a rifle butt, but the guard doesn't even use a swear word. The guard simply picks up a stone from the ground and playfully tosses it at Frankl.
That casual toss is devastating. Think about the psychology of that action. You don't throw a stone at a man to punish him. You throw a stone at a stray dog or a geese of burden just to get its attention and remind it to keep pulling the plow.
By not even deeming Frankl worthy of verbal abuse, the guard completely erases his human status.
Frankl points out that the physical sting of a beating heals, but the mental agony, the profound injustice, the unreasonableness, the casual reduction of a human life to an animal state, that is the trauma that leaves a permanent scar on the psyche.
It's the absolute erasure of dignity. He had another encounter that highlights this too. A foreman with chubby, rosy cheeks starts screaming at Frankl.
The foreman is calling him a pig, mocking him, saying he must have been a soft businessman who never did a real day's work in his life.
Frankl looks this man in the eye and calmly states that he was a doctor, a specialist, and that he actually did most of his work in free clinics for the poor.
The foreman's response is immediate violence. He throws himself at Frankl and knocks him to the ground.
But notice Frankl's internal reaction. Even buried under layers of apathy, he feels his blood boil. He's consumed by indignation.
Not because he was hit.
Exactly. Not because of the physical blow, but because this vulgar, cruel man, who knows nothing of sacrifice or intellect, is standing over him, passing ultimate judgment on a life he couldn't possibly comprehend.
It shows that even in the deepest trenches of emotional death, the spark of inner dignity fiercely resists extinguishment.
What's equally fascinating is how this extreme environment forces a literal regression of the mind. Several psychoanalysts in the camps noted that the prisoners' mental lives regressed to a highly primitive state.
When your body is consuming its own muscle tissue just to keep your heart beating, you don't ponder existentialism. You think about calories.
It is the absolute dominance of the biological imperative. Starvation forces the mind to abandon all higher-order thinking.
Prisoners would be standing in a frozen trench, swinging pickaxes, and their conversations would inevitably drift to food.
They would plan these elaborate imaginary banquets. They would exchange incredibly detailed recipes describing the exact pastries they would eat on the day of their liberation.
But Frankl realizes this is a psychological trap. He warns the other prisoners against it. From a physiological standpoint, provoking a starving body with highly detailed emotional fantasies of rich delicacies is actually dangerous.
Your body is trying to adapt to surviving on a few hundred calories of watery turnip soup, and your brain is flooding your system with the psychological anticipation of a feast. The mental dissonance is agonizing.
He describes the torture of finding a tiny crumb of bread in your pocket, breaking off a microscopic flake, letting it dissolve on your tongue, and then having to summon a superhuman amount of willpower to put the rest back in your pocket so you have something to survive on later in the day.
This regression to the absolute bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs stripped away everything else. For example, the sexual urge completely vanished.
In standard military barracks or prisons, sexual frustration and perversion are rampant. But in the concentration camps, under the weight of true starvation, the organism redirects every single drop of energy to basic survival.
Sex wasn't even a feature in their dreams. All sentimentality was ruthlessly excised from their psychology.
He gives a heartbreaking example of how thorough that loss of sentimentality was. He was on a transport train, packed in with other prisoners, and the train happened to pass directly through Vienna, his hometown.
He maneuvers himself to a small barred peephole in the carriage, and he can actually see his native street.
He begs the prisoners standing in front of him to shift, just for a second, so he can catch one last glimpse of his home.
And their reaction? They flatly, rudely refuse. They snap at him saying, "You live here all those years. Well, then you have seen quite enough already."
There is no empathy. Empathy requires surplus emotional energy, and they have none to spare. Every interaction was transactional and aggressively focused on the self's immediate comfort.
Yet, within this brutal calculus of survival, Frankl introduces a concept that completely changed how I view everyday life. He discusses the relativity of suffering.
Oh, the gas analogy.
Yes, he compares human suffering to the physical properties of a gas.
It is a brilliant analogy. In physics, if you introduce a certain quantity of gas into an empty chamber, it doesn't matter how large or small the chamber is, the gas will expand to completely and evenly fill the entire space.
Frankl argues that human suffering functions in the exact same way within the human soul.
Meaning it completely fills your conscious mind, regardless of the objective size of the problem. Your suffering expands to fill your entire capacity to suffer. Therefore, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative.
Exactly. Because of this relativity, an objectively horrific situation can suddenly produce the greatest joy imaginable simply by being slightly less horrific than anticipated.
For Frankl details a transport where the prisoners were terrified they were being sent to the Mauthausen camp. When the train finally stops, they realize they have arrived at a subcamp of Dachau.
And a wave of euphoria sweeps through the train cars. They are literally dancing in the carriages.
Why? Because Dachau didn't have a chimney. It didn't have a gas chamber.
Think about the context here. These men have been standing up in a crowded train for days. They are starving. They're freezing. Some have been forced to squat in urine-soaked straw.
Upon arrival, they are forced to stand outside in a freezing rainstorm for a punishment parade that lasts through the entire night and into the next morning.
But they are laughing. They are cracking jokes in the freezing rain because they know they aren't going to be gassed that day.
The relativity of their suffering turned a grueling hypothermic punishment into a cause for celebration.
It forces the reader, and you listening right now, to radically contextualize your own stress. But this leads us to what is perhaps the most profound psychological paradox of the entire text.
While the body was degrading and the baseline emotions were blunted into apathy, a completely different phenomena was occurring in the deep architecture of the mind.
Some prisoners were retreating into an invincible inner sanctuary.
And this is where the survival metrics flip upside down. Frankl observes that highly sensitive people, intellectuals who were physically frail and seemingly ill-equipped for brutal manual labor, often survive the psychological destruction of the camps better than the massive, robust, sturdy men.
It defies standard evolutionary logic. You would think the physically strongest would endure the longest.
But Frankl realizes that these sensitive intellectuals possessed a unique defense mechanism, the ability to retreat from their agonizing external environment into a rich, expansive inner life.
The physical damage to their bodies was immense, but the damage to their inner selves was mitigated because they had somewhere else to go psychologically.
He illustrates this beautifully during a scene on a freezing morning march. They're being marched to the worksite in the pitch black.
They are stumbling over icy puddles, their feet are swelling in inadequate shoes, the guards are screaming and hitting them with rifle butts.
The man stumbling next to Frankl whispers through his frozen lips, "If our wives could see us now, I do hope they are better off in their camps and don't know what is happening to us."
That single sentence acts as a catalyst. Frankl's mind violently rejects the horror of the march and immediately latches onto the image of his wife.
As he trudges through the snow, he begins to actively commune with her in his mind. It is not just a memory. It is a vivid, real-time, internal dialogue.
He asks her questions. He hears her answer. He visualizes her smile. He notes that her look in his mind's eye was more luminous than the sun that was just beginning to rise over the horizon.
And in the middle of this frozen hellscape, a profound realization hits him. It is an idea that poets and philosophers have written about for millennia, but he's experiencing it as a concrete, life-saving truth.
He writes, "The salvation of man is through love and in love." He realized that a human being who has been stripped of absolutely everything in the physical world can still experience genuine bliss, even if only for a few moments, through the contemplation of their beloved.
The crucial psychological detail here is that Frankl did not even know if his wife was still alive. He had absolutely no way of finding out.
But in that moment of inner communion, he realizes that her physical status was irrelevant to the power of the experience.
The love transcended her physical existence. It found its deepest meaning in her spiritual core, in the very essence of who she was. The inner life became a sanctuary that the SS guards could not infiltrate no matter how much they beat him.
This intensification of the inner life didn't just apply to love. It extended to a hyper-appreciation for beauty, for art, for nature. Things they would have ignored in their normal lives suddenly possessed an overwhelming power.
Imagine being on a train, assuming you're heading to an extermination camp, and as you pass the mountains of Salzburg, you look through the barred windows and are completely enraptured by the beauty of the sunset glowing on the peaks.
There is another incredible moment he documents. The men are in their mud hut, completely exhausted, effectively starving to death. Suddenly, a fellow prisoner busts through the door and urges everyone to come outside to the assembly grounds immediately.
They drag themselves outside and they just stand there in silence, staring at a magnificent Bavarian sunset.
The sky is exploding with vibrant reds and golds, and it's reflecting perfectly in the filthy, muddy puddles of the camp. One prisoner turns to another and simply says, "How beautiful the world could be."
The absolute bleakness of their physical reality actually amplified their capacity to experience aesthetic wonder.
He shares a deeply intimate moment of this connection to nature, too. He is hacking at the icy ground in a trench. He is at a low point, feeling totally hopeless, questioning whether there is any ultimate purpose to all this senseless suffering.
He forces his mind to pierce through the gloom, reaching for a sense of ultimate meaning, and he feels a victorious yes echo in his spirit.
And at that exact second, a bird flies down, lands silently on the heap of dirt he just dug up, and looks steadily right at him. In the architecture of his inner life, that bird wasn't just an animal, it was an acknowledgement from the universe.
And alongside this reverence for nature and love, they also cultivated art and humor as psychological armor. The prisoners improvised a rudimentary cabaret.
Occasionally, they would clear out a hut, nail some wooden boards together for benches, and guys would get up and sing songs, recite poetry, or tell jokes.
It wasn't about entertainment. It was about achieving a temporary psychological aloofness. It was a brief assertion of their cultured humanity in a place designed to turn them into animals.
I mean, they had a guy singing full Italian arias while they were ladling out watery soup in an unfinished engine room. The prisoners and even some guards loved it so much that the singer was guaranteed a double helping of soup, scooped all the way from the bottom of the vat where the few precious peas were hiding.
And the humor, it was dark, but it was a calculated weapon of self-preservation.
Frankl actually trained a colleague to use humor clinically. He made his friend, who was a surgeon, promise to invent one amusing story every single day.
But the stories had to be about things that might happen after their liberation. They were forcing their minds to construct a future.
Frankl joked that one day his friend would be in a pristine operating room performing a complex surgery, and an orderly would burst through the doors, shouting the brutal camp foreman's catchphrase, "Action! Action!"
They would joke about sitting at a high society dinner party and accidentally begging the wealthy hostess to ladle their soup from the bottom. By laughing at the absurdity of their trauma, they prevented the trauma from completely consuming their identity.
But this sanctuary of the inner life, the humor, the love it, could only sustain a prisoner if it was anchored to something moving forward. Which brings us to the tipping point of survival, finding the why.
The psychology of the concentration camp inmate was fundamentally dictated by their orientation toward time. Frankl describes camp life as a provisional existence of unknown limit.
Think about human motivation. In normal life, our actions are dictated by future goals, graduating, getting a promotion, raising a child. We pull ourselves forward through time.
But a prisoner had no end date. They didn't know if they would be there for a week or a decade. Without an end date, you cannot aim at an ultimate goal. You are effectively cut off from your own future.
He compares this psychological state to unemployed workers during a depression or tuberculosis patients stuck in a sanatorium. When a person loses faith in their future, their entire internal structure begins to rot. Time distorts.
The present moment feels unreal, like a nightmare, and the person just retreats completely into the past.
But Frankl issues a massive clinical warning here. Retreating entirely into the past is fatal. If you ignore the present, you blind yourself to the micro-opportunities to make a positive moral choice in the middle of the horror.
The clinical observation is absolute. When a prisoner lost faith in his future, he was doomed. The psychological collapse triggered an immediate, rapid physical decay. In the brutal slang of the camps, a prisoner who reached this state of total surrender was referred to as a Muslim.
It's a terrifying phase. The Muslim was someone whose will to live had completely evaporated. They became emaciated, glassy-eyed. They would refuse to get up for roll call.
They wouldn't dress. They wouldn't even attempt to go to the sickbay. They would just lie in their own excreta on the wooden boards, completely immune to the screams and blows of the guards.
If they had a hidden cigarette, which was normally traded for life-saving food, they would simply smoke it, staring blankly, waiting for the gas chamber.
Frankl provides a dramatic, tragic case study of exactly how lethal this loss of hope is. He tells the story of his senior block warden, a relatively well-known composer named F.
In February, F pulls Frankl aside and confides a secret. He says he had a vivid dream where a voice told him he could ask for anything. F asked the voice when the war would end for him.
The voice replied with a specific date, March 30th.
When F tells Frankl this in February, he is energized. He is full of hope. But as March marches on, the news filtering into the camp is grim. The front lines aren't moving fast enough.
It becomes mathematically obvious that they will not be liberated by March 30th.
F watches the calendar, and as the date approaches, his hope turns into severe anxiety and then into crushing despair. On March 29th, F suddenly falls violently ill with a high fever.
On March 30th, the exact day of his prophecy, he becomes delirious and loses consciousness. On March 31st, he is dead.
The official camp register listed the cause of death as typhus, but Frankl, analyzing the timeline, diagnoses the ultimate cause as a severe, acute disappointment.
The sudden, catastrophic loss of hope essentially paralyzed F's immune system. His body, which had been fighting off latent infections through sheer willpower, simply surrendered. The typhus merely capitalized on the psychological collapse.
The camp's chief medical doctor corroborated this phenomenon on a mass scale. He noted a massive, unprecedented spike in the camp death rate between Christmas 1944 and New Year's 1945.
It wasn't due to colder weather or harsher labor or worse rations. It was because the majority of the prisoners had harbored a naive hope that they would be home by Christmas. When the holiday arrived and they were still behind barbed wire, their collective hope died, and their bodies immediately followed suit.
So, what does this all mean for us? How do you combat a despair that can literally shut down your immune system? Frankl turns to a profound quote from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, which essentially becomes the central pillar of his entire psychological framework.
He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how.
That is the crux of survival. A prisoner absolutely required a future goal, a why. Woe to the man who looked at his life and saw no more sense, no aim, no purpose.
But here is the monumental, paradigm-shifting realization that Frankl brings to modern psychology. Normally, when people are depressed, they ask, what is the meaning of life? They expect the universe, or life, to present them with a grand, comforting answer.
Frankl says this is entirely the wrong approach. We
Hmm.
have to execute a Copernican shift in our perspective. We have to reverse the question.
Yes. We had to start sitting around asking what we expect from life and realize that life is expecting something from us. Life is questioning us daily and hourly.
We are the ones being interrogated, and our answer cannot be just philosophical talk or meditation. Our answer must manifest in right action and right conduct.
Meaning isn't some vague, ethereal concept floating in the clouds. It is fiercely real and highly concrete. It differs from person to person and from hour to hour.
You cannot ask what the general meaning of life is any more than you can ask a grandmaster what the best chess move in the world is.
The best move depends entirely on the specific arrangement of the pieces on the board in that exact moment. And here's the heaviest, most demanding part of Frankl's realization. When a man finds that his specific destiny is to suffer, he has to accept his suffering as his unique, assigned task.
That is a staggering thought. Suffering itself becomes the task. In the camp, this realization changed everything. They stopped harboring fake optimism or waiting for a miraculous rescue. They realized that their suffering had dignity.
There is a powerful scene where the entire camp was forced to fast for a day as punishment because someone stole a few potatoes and the camp refused to give up the thief.
They are starving, freezing, sitting in the pitch black of their hut, and morale is at absolute rock bottom. The men are essentially slipping into the Muslim state, and someone asks Frankl to speak to the hut.
Frankl is exhausted. He is freezing. The last thing he wants to do is give a sermon. But he recognizes the psychological emergency. He speaks to them in the dark.
He talks about the future, yes, reminding them that no one knows what the next hour might bring. But more importantly, he shifts their focus to the past. He quotes a poet saying, "What you have experienced, no power on earth can take from you."
He reminds these starving men that their past joys, their intellectual achievements, and most importantly, the sufferings they have bravely borne, are irrevocably stored in the fabric of existence.
He looks out into the darkness and tells them that human life never, under any circumstances, ceases to have meaning, and that this infinite meaning includes suffering and dying. He asks them to face their executioners, to face their starvation, with a quiet courage.
He suggests that someone, perhaps a dead friend, a wife, or a god, is looking down on them in this exact moment, expecting them to suffer proudly and demonstrate how to die with dignity.
And it fundamentally alters the atmosphere. When the harsh camp lights flicker back on, men come limping over to him in tears, thanking him. He didn't promise them rescue. He gave them a why for their immediate suffering.
And for a fraction of those men, the suffering did eventually end. The front lines broke, the SS fled, and the liberation finally arrived. But the psychological reality of that liberation introduces an incredibly complex phase.
You would naturally assume that the day the gates opened would be a scene of unbridled, ecstatic joy. But the clinical reality was vastly, disturbingly different.
He describes the day the white flag was finally hoisted. The tension suddenly snaps. The guards who haven't fled suddenly appear in civilian clothes, attempting to offer the prisoners cigarettes.
The gates are open, the prisoners drag themselves out, they walk into the surrounding meadows, they look at the flowers, they see a rooster with brightly colored feathers, but they feel absolutely nothing. There is no joy.
The concept of freedom had been fantasized about so intensely for so many years that it had completely lost its connection to reality.
In clinical psychiatry, this condition is known as depersonalization. The trauma has been so prolonged that reality itself feels unlikely, illusory, like a dream.
The prisoners had been psychologically tortured by dreams so many times in the camp, dreaming of a warm bath or a family reunion, only to be violently awakened by the guard's whistle, that their brains simply refused to trust this new reality.
When the men gathered that first night and asked each other, "Tell me, were you pleased today?" the honest, uniform answer was, to tell you the truth, no. They had lost the neurological capacity to feel joy. They literally had to relearn, step by step, how to experience positive emotion.
This raises an important question, though, because holding on to that internal why creates a new, unforeseen danger when the nightmare actually ends. You'd think liberation would be pure relief, but psychically it's highly volatile.
Frankl compares it to a deep-sea diver. If a diver is under enormous atmospheric pressure and comes up to the surface too quickly, the nitrogen in their blood bubbles, causing the bends, which can be fatal.
The human psyche operates on the exact same principle. The sudden, violent release of enormous psychological pressure creates a severe moral hazard.
This is a critical observation regarding the cycle of trauma. Some prisoners, particularly those whose moral frameworks had been entirely eroded by the camp environment, suddenly found themselves transitioning from the oppressed to the oppressor.
Because they had suffered so unimaginably, they felt ethically justified in using their newfound freedom ruthlessly. They believed their trauma gave them a blank check for vengeance and licentious behavior.
There is a vivid, disturbing story about this. Shortly after liberation, Frankl is walking through the countryside with a fellow survivor. They approach a field of young, green crops. Frankl instinctively alters his path to avoid trampling the new growth.
But his friend grabs his arm and drags him right through the middle of the field, crushing the stalks.
When Frankl stops and asks him why he's ruining the crops, his friend erupts in rage. He shouts, "Hasn't enough been taken from us? My wife and child have been gassed, and you would forbid me to tread on a few stalks of oats."
It perfectly illustrates moral deformity. This man wasn't inherently evil. Frankl specifically notes that he had been a solid, supportive comrade inside the camp, but the release of pressure deformed his ethics.
He had to be slowly, patiently guided back to the fundamental truth that no one has the right to do wrong, not even if the most horrific wrong has been done to them. Trauma is an explanation, but it is not a moral license.
And beyond that moral danger, the survivors faced two massive psychological blows upon returning to society: bitterness and disillusionment. The bitterness came from encountering the profound superficiality of the world they returned to.
They would go back to their hometowns looking for acknowledgement of their abyss, and they would be met by former neighbors who would just shrug. Or worse, people would offer these hollow, hackneyed phrases like, "We didn't know," or, "Well, we suffered too with the rationing."
It made the survivors feel completely alienated, wondering why they had fought so hard to survive, to return to a society that didn't care.
But the disillusionment was the fatal blow for many. Bitterness was directed at society. Disillusionment was the shattering of their deepest personal hope.
This occurred when a man finally made the journey back to his home city, perhaps boarding the exact trolley line he had vividly hallucinated riding 1,000 times in the camp.
He walks up to his front door, rings the bell, expecting the moment of ultimate salvation, only to discover that the person who kept him alive in his mind, the wife, the child, the parent, is not there and will never be there again.
The realization that the earthly happiness they dreamed of was permanently gone was devastating. Frankl, stepping back into his role as a psychiatrist, notes that this specific disillusionment was the hardest clinical challenge to treat.
But he also notes that eventually, for those who navigate through it, a day arrives when the entirety of the camp experience feels like nothing more than a bizarre, distant nightmare.
And the crowning psychological victory for the survivor is the profound realization that after everything they have endured, there is absolutely nothing left in the world they ever need to fear again.
That triumph of the human spirit acts as the foundation for the second half of Frankl's work. He takes these harrowing, extreme experiential observations and codifies them into a formal, structured psychiatric framework.
This framework is logotherapy, which is widely recognized as the third Viennese school of psychotherapy.
Let's clearly define what makes logotherapy so revolutionary by contrasting it with the first two schools, because this highlights why Frankl's theory resonates so deeply today.
The first Viennese school is Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis. Freud essentially argued that human beings are driven by the will to pleasure. We are biological machines motivated by basic instincts, drives, and the pursuit of gratification.
The second school is Alfred Adler's psychology, which posits that we are driven by the will to power. We are motivated by a desire for status, superiority, and overcoming feelings of inferiority.
But the crucible of the concentration camps burned both of those theories to the ground. In a starvation environment, the will to pleasure becomes entirely irrelevant. When you are stripped naked and reduced to a number, the will to power is a laughable absurdity.
What Frankl observed was that when you take away pleasure and you take away power, humans don't just stop functioning, they search for meaning. Logos is a Greek word denoting meaning.
Frankl argues that the primary, fundamental motivational force in a human being is the will to meaning. If a person can find meaning, they can survive without power and without pleasure. But if this will to meaning is frustrated, it creates a psychological pathology that Frankl calls the existential vacuum.
And this existential vacuum is exactly where this deep dive connects to you, the listener. Frankl isn't just diagnosing Holocaust survivors, he is diagnosing modern society.
He points out that as humanity evolved, We lost the basic animal instincts that automatically dictated what we had to do.
Then, as modern society modernized, we stripped away the rigid traditions and religious structures that told us what we ought to do. Bereft of instinct and tradition, modern humans are left with a terrifying void.
Not knowing what to do, people either fall into conformism, doing what everyone else is doing, or they fall into totalitarianism, doing exactly what authoritarian figures tell them to do.
The existential vacuum manifests most commonly as a pervasive state of profound boredom and pointlessness. Frankl actually coined the term Sunday neurosis.
It perfectly describes that specific sinking anxiety or mild depression that hits people late on a Sunday afternoon. The frantic rush of the work week, the emails, the meetings, the distractions suddenly stops.
The noise clears, and in that silence, the void within themselves becomes starkly apparent. They are suddenly confronted with the reality that their lives lack deeper content or ultimate purpose.
We see this everywhere today. It's the doom-scrolling phenomenon. It is the burnout and the gig economy. It's the no-future generation.
Frankl draws a direct clinical line from this existential vacuum to massive societal issues like widespread depression, aggression, and addiction. People have more resources and free time than any generation in human history. They have the means to live, but they have absolutely no meaning to live for.
So how do they fill the void? They try to stuff it with frantic pursuits. The obsessive hoarding of wealth, compulsive sexual compensation, drugs, or even senseless violence. It's all an attempt to numb the awareness of the vacuum.
So the crucial question becomes, how does logotherapy cure the existential vacuum? The therapist's role is to help the patient discover the specific meaning in their own life.
But again, logotherapy stresses that there is no abstract, universal meaning of life. You have to locate it in your specific reality. Frankl outlines 3 distinct, actionable avenues through which any human being can discover meaning.
Avenue number 1, creating a work or doing a deed. This is the path of active creation. It could be writing a book, building a business, raising a child, or dedicating yourself to a specific craft. It is the act of leaving your unique, irreplaceable mark on the world.
Avenue number 2, experiencing something or encountering someone. This is the receptive path. It includes being moved by nature, experiencing profound art or culture, but most importantly, it involves love.
In logotherapy, love is not just an emotion, it is a cognitive act. Frankl states that love is the only way to grasp another human being in the absolute innermost core of their personality. When you love someone, you see their potential, and by loving them, you actually help them actualize that potential.
And the third avenue, which is the most challenging and the one most vividly demonstrated in the camps, the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering.
When we are backed into a corner by a hopeless situation, an inoperable terminal illness, the sudden loss of a loved one, a situation we absolutely cannot change, we are challenged to change ourselves. We have the opportunity to transform a personal tragedy into a triumph of the human spirit.
But there is a massive vital caveat here that we must address. Frankl is exceptionally clear on this point. Suffering is not a prerequisite for finding meaning.
You do not need to actively seek out pain or martyrdom to live a profoundly meaningful life.
In fact, if your suffering is avoidable, if you are in a toxic relationship or a destructive job, the most meaningful thing you can do is to remove the cause of the suffering. To suffer unnecessarily when you have the power to stop it is not heroic, it is masochistic. Meaning is derived from suffering only when the suffering is truly, factually unavoidable.
That distinction is so important. Now, once a person grasps this framework of meaning, logotherapy employs some incredibly fascinating clinical techniques to help them overcome specific neuroses. This brings us to the practical application of Frankl's theories, specifically a technique he developed called paradoxical intention.
This completely flips the script on how we handle anxiety.
To understand why paradoxical intention works, we have to look at the mechanics of fear. Frankl identified 2 psychological feedback loops that trap people: hyperintention and anticipatory anxiety.
Hyperintention is when you want something so badly and you try so incredibly hard to achieve it that your sheer effort makes it neurologically impossible. The classic example is insomnia. The more you intensely focus on falling asleep, the more activated your brain becomes, ensuring you stay wide awake.
And anticipatory anxiety is the cruelest trick of the mind. It's when the fear of an event actually causes the very event to happen. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
If you are terrified that you're going to blush uncontrollably when you give a presentation, your autonomic nervous system goes into overdrive precisely because of that fear, and you walk on stage and immediately turn bright red. The fear is the mother of the event.
So paradoxical intention is the therapeutic intervention that breaks this loop. The therapist instructs the patient to do the exact literal opposite of what their anxiety is screaming at them to do.
Instead of fighting the fear, you are told to actively intend and aggressively exaggerate the very thing you are terrified of.
The clinical examples he provides are amazing. There's the story of a young doctor who suffered from severe hyperhidrosis. He was terrified of sweating in public. And of course, the more he feared sweating, the more his sympathetic nervous system dumped adrenaline, and he would sweat profusely. He was ruining his career.
Frankl advised this doctor to deliberately resolve to show everyone how much he could sweat. He told him, the next time you meet someone and feel the anxiety rising, say to yourself, I only sweated out a quart before, but now I'm going to pour at least 10 quarts. I'm going to show them what a real sweater looks like.
And it worked. By turning his fear into a ridiculous, exaggerated, paradoxical wish, he completely bypassed his fight-or-flight response. He took the wind out of the anxiety sails. Within 1 week, a phobia he had been paralyzed by for 4 years completely vanished. He broke the neurological loop.
He applied the same technique to a bookkeeper who had developed a severe case of writer's cramp. The man was on the verge of losing his livelihood because he couldn't write legibly. The more he tried to force his hand to write neatly, the tighter his muscles cramped.
Frankl told him to stop trying to write well. Instead, he instructed him to deliberately try to scribble as terribly and illegibly as possible. He was told to think, I will show people what a magnificent scribbler I am. And the absolute moment the man actively tried to scrawl on purpose, his hand relaxed. He literally couldn't do it. The cramp disappeared.
Or the severe stutterer who had been plagued by his speech impediment his entire life, except for one single incident. When he was 12 years old, he hooked a ride on the back of a streetcar and got caught by the conductor.
To get out of trouble, he decided to play on the conductor's sympathies by demonstrating what a poor, pathetic, stuttering boy he was. But when he actively tried to stutter on purpose to elicit pity, he couldn't do it. His speech was perfectly fluent.
The mechanism underlying paradoxical intention is self-detachment. It requires a specific kind of humor to step outside of your own neurosis, look at it objectively, and laugh at its absurdity. This forces the engagement of the parasympathetic nervous system, calming the body.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this clinical technique points to Frankl's broader philosophical conclusion about the cure for modern neurosis: self-transcendence.
Yes. The underlying message is that the more you obsessively focus on yourself, your own symptoms, your own happiness, your own optimization, the more trapped and miserable you become. Frankl argues that true self-actualization is not something you can aim for directly. It is only possible as a side effect of self-transcendence.
You have to forget yourself. You have to give yourself over entirely to a cause greater than yourself or to another person to love. Happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue.
Which leads us to the final, culminating philosophical concept of the book, tragic optimism. Frankl acknowledges that human existence is inherently fraught. He introduces what he calls the tragic triad. These are the 3 inescapable realities that every single human being will face: pain, guilt, and death.
The ultimate existential challenge is, how do we remain optimistic? How do we say a defiant yes to life in the face of this triad?
You can't just mandate optimism. You can't command someone to be hopeful any more than you can command them to find a joke funny. You have to provide a reason for it. Tragic optimism is the human capacity to creatively turn life's negative aspects into something constructive.
It is the choice to turn pain into human achievement, to derive from our guilt the opportunity to change and grow, and to use the inevitability of death as an incentive to take responsible action right now.
Frankl highlights a powerful modern example of this defiant power of the human spirit. He introduces the story of a young man named Jerry Long. Jerry was a teenager who suffered a catastrophic diving accident that left him paralyzed from the neck down. He became a quadriplegic, forced to type using a stick in his mouth.
But Jerry refused to let the tragic triad define him. He didn't succumb to the existential vacuum. He famously wrote to Frankl saying, "I broke my neck, it didn't break me." Jerry went on to take psychology courses via Intercom. He dedicated his life to studying so he could counsel others, firmly believing that his severe handicap actually enhanced his ability to connect with and help people who were suffering. He transformed an objective tragedy into an profound source of meaning.
Jerry Long's life perfectly exemplifies Frankl's fierce rejection of a concept called pandeterminism, Pandeterminism is the pervasive, often cynical theory that human beings are nothing but the result of their biological constraints, psychological conditioning, and sociological environment.
It is the belief that we are just highly complex biological machines, complete victims of our genetics and circumstances. Frankl wholly and aggressively rejects this. He concedes that we are absolutely subject to conditions, but he insists that we retain the ultimate freedom to take a stand toward those conditions.
We are ultimately self-determining. You in this exact moment decide what your existence will be in the next moment. And to prove just how radically unpredictable and free human behavior truly is, Frankl shares the astonishing story of Dr. J.
Dr. J was an infamous figure in Vienna, widely known as the mass murderer of Steinhof. He was a fanatical, high-ranking doctor who orchestrated the Nazi euthanasia program at a psychiatric hospital. He was a truly monstrous figure who systematically hunted down the mentally ill to send them to the gas chambers. After the war ended, Dr. J disappeared and was presumed dead, eventually captured and imprisoned by the Russian forces in the notorious Lubyanka prison in Moscow.
Years later, Frankl happens to meet an Austrian diplomat who had recently been released from Lubyanka. Frankl asks him if he ever crossed paths with Dr. J. The diplomat confirms that Dr. J did eventually die of cancer in the prison. But the diplomat adds a detail that is completely mind-blowing.
He tells Frankl that before Dr. J died, he was remembered by all his fellow inmates from various backgrounds and nationalities as the absolute best comrade they had ever had. In the squalor of a Russian prison, the former mass murderer lived up to the highest conceivable moral standard, offering medical care, consolation, and strength to everyone around him.
It is a stunning testament to the capacity for human change. The man who orchestrated mass murder became a saintly, self-sacrificing figure when stripped of his power and placed in a prison. It proves Frankl's point. You cannot predict the behavior of a human being like you predict the output of a machine. We retain the freedom to completely alter our moral trajectory at any given instant. However, Frankl issues one final, crucial warning about this freedom. He notes that freedom is only half of the equation. Freedom is merely the negative aspect of the phenomenon. The positive, necessary counterpart is responsibility.
I absolutely love how he visualizes this concept. He writes that freedom is constantly in danger of degenerating into mere arbitrariness and selfishness unless it is lived in terms of responsibleness. To make this concrete, he actually suggests that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast of the United States should be immediately supplemented by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast, because freedom without responsibility is a recipe for disaster.
As we synthesize Frankl's work, the ultimate takeaway is a complete reframing of how we interact with life. Meaning is not something that is handed to you on a silver platter. Life is constantly pitching you unique, specific problems, and it is waiting for your specific answer. You are not a victim of your circumstances unless you consciously choose to surrender your inner freedom to them.
The profound message here for you, listening right now, is that your ultimate value as a human being is based entirely on the dignity of your existence and the values you have realized in your life. Your value is completely divorced from your mere usefulness to society. Our modern society practically worships the highly functioning, the youthful, the economically productive. But Frankl proves that human dignity is an indelible mark. It remains completely intact, whether you are a wealthy CEO, an unemployed worker, a patient in a hospital bed, or a paralyzed teenager typing with a mouth stick.
And this realization naturally leads to Frankl's incredibly beautiful, deeply provocative perspective on aging and the passage of time. Our culture is terrified of aging. We view the transitoriness of life, the fact that time passes, doors close, and physical capabilities fade, as a tragic curse. But logotherapy flips this entirely. Frankl argues that we should not pity the elderly. We should deeply envy them.
Because the possibilities of youth are exactly that. Just possibilities. They're unproven. But the actions of the past, the choices you have already made, are concrete realities. Every positive deed you've done, every person you've loved, and every single bout of suffering you have bravely endured is not lost to the wind. Frankl says these moments have been irrevocably stored and treasured in what he beautifully calls the granaries of the past. You have safely delivered those experiences out of the transitoriness of time and locked them securely into eternity. No one can ever take them away from you.
So as you step back into your daily routine, as you face the inevitable frustrations and the occasional profound sufferings of your own life, consider the final imperative that Frankl leaves us with. He asks us to live with the profound gravity, the urgency, and the responsibility of a person who has been given a miraculous second chance.
I want you to really think about this as we go. Here's the challenge he lays out. Live today as if you were living for the second time and had acted as wrongly the first time as you were about to act now. Imagine the clarity that gives you. Ask yourself, in the face of whatever stressor is sitting on your desk right now, what is life asking of me in this exact moment? The answer is your meaning. Until next time, keep diving deep.